Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. The snow had been falling for a long while before Elara noticed that the storm had softened. It did not stop. It would not stop. Not yet. Perhaps not for days. But it gentled, as though the sky had grown tired of its own urgency and decided at last to simply let the flakes descend at their own pace. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though she had long since stopped consulting her watch. The path she had been following had dissolved somewhere behind her, swallowed by the white, and she had continued forward, not because she knew where forward led, but because forward was warmer than standing still. The valley appeared without announcement. One moment there was only the blue-grey dark between the trees, the soft percussion of snow on her coat, the sound of her own breathing, and then the trees thinned, and below her, cupped in the hollow of the hills like a lantern, in a pair of gentle hands, there was a village. She stood at the edge of the wood and looked down at it for a long moment. The windows glowed like steady stars, not the harsh blue-white glare of modern lights, but something warmer, something that seemed to breathe. Amber, the colour of beeswax candles left burning through the long dark of an autumn evening. The rooftops were thick with snow, their lines softened into gentle curves, and the streets between them were unbroken white, unmarked by any wheel or boot. The snow fell in patient silence over all of it, unhurried, as though it had been falling here since the beginning of things and fully intended to continue. Elara began to walk down toward the village. The snow fell in patient silence around her, each flake distinct and unhurried, and she found that her pulse, which had been quick with cold and something close to fear, was slowing as she descended. There was something about the village, the steadiness of its windows, the undisturbed perfection of its streets, the way the light seemed to pool between the houses as though it had nowhere else to be, that asked nothing of her, not explanation, not direction, not the name of where she had come from or where she was going. The inn was at the centre of the village, as she somehow knew it would be, a low building of dark timber and pale stone, its sign unreadable in the dark, its door a warm rectangle of firelight when she pushed it open. The smell reached her first, wood smoke and beeswax, and something sweeter beneath, dried herbs, perhaps, or old wood that had absorbed decades of winter evenings into its grain. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in, and something in her chest, something she had not known was clenched, began slowly to open. The innkeeper was an older woman with a face made entirely of patience. She did not ask where Elara had come from, nor express any surprise at her arrival. She simply looked up from the fire she had been tending, her movements unhurried, the iron poker returning to its stand with a soft, satisfied clink, and said, in a voice like the far side of a long rest, "You'll be wanting a room." It was not a question. Elara said yes, and the innkeeper nodded once, the way one nods at something that has always been true, and led her up a staircase of worn and gentle wood, each step sighing softly underfoot, to a small room at the back of the building where a fire already burned in the grate. The room was not large, but it was the kind of room that holds warmth the way good rooms do. Not just the warmth of the fire, but the warmth of having been cared for over many years. The walls were plaster, faintly yellowed by candlelight, and the bed was high and wide with a quilt of many colours, each patch soft from long washing. There was a window, one window, and through it, past the steady fall of snow, Elara could see the face of a church clock. The clock was frozen. Its hands stood at a quarter past some forgotten hour. She could not make out which one through the snow, and they did not move. She stood at the glass for a moment, the cool of it pressing gently against her forehead, and watched the snow fall in patient silence across the frozen clock face. The village asked nothing of those who came. It simply held its breath and waited and let the snow cover everything in quiet. She sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off her boots, and the warmth of the room rose around her like water around someone stepping slowly into a bath. The fire crackled outside. The snow fell. The frozen clock held its eternal hour without complaint. It was only when she reached to set her things on the bedside table that she noticed the book. It was small. She could hold it in one hand, and bound in leather so worn that its original colour was impossible to determine. Something between brown and grey, the shade of old winter bark. The cover was blank. No title, no author, no gilded letters. She picked it up and felt the softness of the leather against her palm, the gentle give of it, the way it fit her hand as though it had been made for hands exactly like hers. She opened it. The first page was handwritten in a careful upright script. The ink faded to the colour of weak tea. A single sentence beginning at the left margin and ending before the right. I stayed because I was ready to stop. She turned the page, another hand, looser, the letters leaning slightly forward as though walking into wind. Wrote the same words. She turned again. A third hand, this one so small that she had to lean close to read it, the letters cramped and precise and somehow urged. She turned again and again and again. Each page held a single line, and each line was the same, and each hand was different. Some were firm and dark, pressed deeply into the paper. Some were light, almost hesitant, as though the pen had hovered before touching the page. One was written in a hand that trembled slightly. Old age, or cold, or the particular tremor that comes with profound relief. One was so large that the sentence barely fit on the page, each letter wide and open and sure. One was in a language she did not recognize, but the shape of the words, even translated through an unfamiliar alphabet, carried the same weight, the same quiet conclusion. She turned pages for a long time. The fire crackled softly. The snow fell in patient silence outside the window. The frozen clock held its eternal hour and made no apology for it. The book was not thick, but it held many pages, many hands. Many travellers who had sat in this room, perhaps in this exact bed, had felt the warmth of this fire and seen the snow falling across that clock, and had reached for this book and had turned its pages as she was turning them now, and had understood something that she was only beginning to understand. She did not know how long she sat with the book in her lap after she had turned the last written page. The page after was blank. Many pages were blank. The book was not finished. It was waiting. Why did they stop? The question formed in her mind, quiet and without urgency. She turned it over gently, the way one turns a smooth stone found on a riverbed, not looking for an answer so much as feeling the question's shape. Why did they stop? And why? This was the stranger part. The part that made something deep in her chest shift and settle. Why does the thought of stopping feel so peaceful? She woke in the morning, or what passed for morning. The light was the same soft suspended blue it had been when she arrived, and sat for a long time in the chair by the window with a cup of tea the innkeeper had left outside her door, its warmth bleeding through the ceramic into her palms. The snow fell in patient silence. The frozen clock held its eternal hour. The village streets were still unbroken, still white, still asking nothing. She thought about her life before. She did not think about it with regret, exactly, or with longing. Both of those feelings require a certainty about what one has lost that she was not sure she possessed. She thought about it the way one thinks about a room one has lived in for many years, and then, one day, walked out of with recognition and some tenderness and a quiet acknowledgement that the walls had been close and that the air inside had grown thick and that one had not noticed how much effort it cost to breathe there until one stepped outside. There had been schedules. There had always been schedules, the particular kind that do not announce themselves as schedules, but simply accumulate day by day until one is not so much living as being carried forward by the current of obligation. Wake at a certain hour, answer the waiting messages, move from one appointed place to the next, each place with its own requirements, its own demands, its own small erosions of the self. She had been good at it. That was the thing she had never thought to question. She had been good at the rushing, and so she had never stopped to wonder whether rushing was good for her. She had not known she was tired. That was perhaps the most startling revelation of sitting in this chair, in this room, watching the snow fall in patient silence over a village that kept no time. She had known she was busy, and busy had become so entirely synonymous with living that she had never examined the space between the two. But now, in the extraordinary quiet of this room, with the fire soft at her back and the snow patient at her window, she understood that there is a tiredness that does not announce itself, that simply gathers, the way snow gathers on a branch, not in a single fall, but in the accumulation of many small, silent additions, until one morning the branch bends under a weight that was not there the evening before. She had been carrying that weight for a long time. Perhaps she had been carrying it for years. She had simply not had a window to look out of. Not this kind of window, not one that looked onto a frozen clock in a village that asked nothing of those who came, and so she had not known to put it down. The travellers who wrote those words were not lost. She understood that now, clearly, in the particular clarity that comes not from thinking hard, but from thinking slowly, from letting a thought unfold at its own pace, like a letter opened carefully rather than torn. They were not lost. Each of them had arrived here as she had, by some combination of storm and wrong turning, and the particular desperation of the body for rest. And each of them had looked around this room, felt this warmth, seen this frozen clock, and found in the finding that they had been looking for exactly this without knowing they were looking. They had found a place where time did not demand anything of them. That was the extraordinary thing, not the frozen clock, which was, after all, simply a clock, and clocks stop all the time, but the permission that stopping granted in the world she had come from. Stopped clocks were problems to be solved. Here the stopped clock was a gift. It said, "You do not have to be anywhere." It said, "There is no..." It said, "This moment, this quiet, this warmth, this snow, this is enough. You are enough simply by being here, simply by resting." The book was not a record of escape. She turned this over slowly, feeling the truth of it settle into her like warmth, settling into cold hands, not escape, arrival. Each traveller who had sat in this room and opened this book and read those words, "I stayed because I was ready to stop," and then, finally, written them in their own hand, had not been fleeing something. They had been arriving at something. The village did not take anything from its visitors. It simply offered them what they had already earned by the long effort of arrival. The firm hand and the trembling hand and the small cramped hand and the large open hand, the unknown alphabet. She did not need to know any of their stories. The book, in its wisdom, withheld them, but she could feel the shape of what each of them had carried because she recognized the weight. Each of them had been rushing in their own way, in their own life, towards something that kept moving just ahead of them. Each of them had arrived here by accident or by a kind of readiness that masquerades as accident, and each of them had understood, in this room with this fire, with this book, the thing they had been rushing toward was stillness, and stillness had been here all along, waiting for them to stop. The tea cooled in her hands outside. The snow fell in patient silence. The frozen clock held its eternal hour, and she looked at it with something that was not sadness, and was not quite joy, but lived in the quiet country between the two, a feeling for which she did not have a word, though it felt like recognition, like setting something heavy down on a table after carrying it for so long that you have forgotten it was not a part of your body. The understanding came not as a revelation, not as the sudden bright crack of something breaking open, but as the gradual revelation of a landscape that has been there all along, only obscured by weather. The fog lifts. The hills are where they always were. Of course, they were always there. She did not need to know where the village was. She had looked at her map, had pulled it from her bag, and spread it on the small desk by the door, and found, as she had somehow expected, that the valley was not marked on it. There was the road she had been following. There were the hills on either side, and then, where the village should have been, there was simply the gentle shading of elevation, the topographical lines of a place the cartographers had passed over, or had missed, or had found and chosen not to mark, as one sometimes chooses not to write down the most important things. It did not matter. She folded the map and set it on the desk and did not look at it again. She did not need to know how long she had been here. She had stopped looking at her watch on the first evening, and now, after a night of the deepest sleep she could remember, a sleep without dreams, or rather, a sleep that was itself a kind of dream, warm and dark and perfectly still. She found that she had no particular interest in resuming the habit time. Here was not a river it was more like a lake, present, full, sufficient, going nowhere in particular, and entirely content with that. She picked up the book from the bedside table. She held it in her lap and looked at the last written page for a long while, her thumb resting gently on the words. Then she reached into her coat pocket. It was hanging on the chair, still faintly damp from the walk through the storm, though even that was drying slowly in the warmth, and found what she had hoped to find, a pen, a small, somewhat battered pen that she had carried for years, that had signed letters and notes and the margins of books and the backs of receipts on trains, that had written in many rooms, and none of them quite like this one. She held the pen over the blank page for a moment. She was not composing anything. There was nothing to compose. The sentence was already written, had already been written many times, in many hands, in many rooms that were all this room. She was simply adding her hand to the count. She was simply saying, "Yes, I was here. I understood. I stayed." The pen touched the page. She wrote slowly in her own ordinary hand, not stylized, not performed, simply hers, the hand she had written in since she was a child, the hand that was the shape of her particular self on paper. I stayed because I was ready to stop. She set the pen down. She closed the book gently, feeling the soft click of the cover against the pages, and placed it back on the... She smoothed the cover once with her palm, the worn leather warm from her hands, and then she let it go. It would wait. The book was patient. It had been waiting a long time for each of its hands, and it would wait for the next one, and the one after that, and so on for as long as people found themselves walking through storms toward lights they had not expected to see. The book, like the village, like the frozen clock, like the snow itself, had no relationship with urgency. It simply was, and would be, and would wait. She dressed slowly and went downstairs. The innkeeper was at the fire and looked up with the same expression of patient welcome, as though Elara had simply stepped out for a moment, rather than return. There was bread on the table, and butter, and a pot of something hot that smelled of herbs. She could not name, but that tasted, when she sipped it, like warmth made liquid. She ate without hurry. She had nowhere to be. When she asked about the time, the innkeeper smiled gently without condescension, the way one smiles at a question that one remembers asking once, long ago, and has since learned to live without the answer. "We don't keep time here," she said, and returned her attention to the fire. Elara nodded. She wrapped her hands around her cup and looked out the window at the village street. Still white, still unbroken, the snow falling in patient silence over everything. She would walk the paths today. She would follow the sound of the stream. She could hear it now, a low and steady murmur just at the edge of audibility, the voice of water that moved even in winter, that had always moved, that would always move, and find where it went. She would sit in the church where the clock did not move and listen to the particular silence of a space that has held a great deal of time, and learned not to be troubled by it. She would not leave, not yet, perhaps not ever. The thought arrived without drama, without the anxiety she might have expected, without the pull of obligation, the tug of the unfinished, the usual insistence of the world that she return to it immediately. She examined the thought with the same gentle attention she had been giving to everything since she arrived, turned it over, found it true, and set it down. Some places are not found by accident. Some places are found by readiness. She had been ready for a long time, had been carrying her readiness as one carries a key without knowing what it opens, and the storm had brought her here, and here had opened to receive her. And now she was inside, and the key was no longer needed, because the door had closed behind her, softly, without a sound. The snow continued to fall, soft and patient, over the village. It fell on the church roof, and on the inn roof, and on the smooth white streets, and on the face of the frozen clock, which held its eternal hour without apology or explanation. The stream murmured in the distance, the one sound in all that whiteness that was not silence, though it was close to silence, though it was the sound that silence makes when it is full enough to overflow. Elara slept that night as she had slept the night before, deeply, without urgency, the way one sleeps when the body finally believes that it is permitted to stop. And in her sleep she walked the quiet streets of the village, her footsteps leaving soft impressions in the snow that filled in slowly behind her, so that there was never any record of where she had been, only the ongoing present of where she was. The windows glowed like steady stars on either side of her. The snow fell in patient silence. The frozen clock held its eternal hour, and in her dream she stood before it for a long moment, and looked at its hands, stopped at their forgotten hour, and felt only gratitude. A gratitude so simple and so complete that she did not need to name it, did not need to understand it, only needed to stand in it, the way one stands in warmth. When she woke, the room was the same, the fire, the warmth, the quilt of many colours, the cool glass of the window, the frozen clock beyond it, the snow falling in patient silence over the perfect white of the village streets. She lay still for a long time, breathing slowly, her hands resting open on the quilt. The book waited on the bedside table, its worn leather cover smooth and patient, its pages full of hands that had chosen to stop somewhere. In another storm on another winter evening, another traveller was walking through the dark between the trees, following a path that was dissolving behind them, moving forward because forward was warmer than standing still. They would crest the hill. They would look down. They would see the windows, glowing like steady stars in the blue, and they would begin to descend. And with each step something in them would slow, the pulse, the breath, the restless turning of the mind, and the village would wait for them as it had always waited, without urgency, without judgment, without any demand except the one it made of everyone who came, which was only this: you are allowed to stop. The snow fell in patient silence over all of it. The frozen clock held its eternal hour. The village sat in its valley, cupped in the hollow of the hills, warm in its windows, untroubled by the turning of the days, asking nothing of those who came, offering only what they had always needed and had never known how to name. The stream murmured as it had always murmured, as it would always murmur. The one sound in all that white and quiet that was not silence, the sound that said, Something moves, even here, even in the stillness, even in the deepest rest. Something is always gently, steadily, unhurriedly on its way. You can simply be the one who stopped, and heard it, and was glad. The snow fell, the clock held, Elara slept.